Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast, or that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. Starting off, we'll take a look at the warnings that we do have out. This is all along the Alaska Range to include some areas of the upper Kuskokwim Valley, down in the Deltana and Tanana Flats areas, and then for the Alaska Highway from Tanana Cross and areas further to the west. We have all of these are high wind warnings. Starting off in the Alaska Range, we have 70 mile per hour gusts possible for areas in and around the passes. That does include areas around the passes of the upper Kuskokwim Valley. And those ones in the western portions of the Alaska Range are going to start off 7 p.m. this evening. And then as we start from the western locations, expiring 4 p.m. on Monday. As we get closer towards the park, we get that expiring on 7 p.m. Monday. And then as we look on the eastern parts of the Alaska Range, expiring on 1 a.m. on Tuesday morning. And the winds are going to be a little bit stronger over there in the eastern part of the Alaska Range, up to as high as 80 mile per hour gusts. Again, that is in and around the passes of the Alaska Range. For Deltana and Tanana Flats areas, we have gusts up to 70 miles per hour, and that's going to start at 10 p.m. today and then go until 7 p.m. on Monday evening. Then for the Alaska Highway, from areas from Tanana Cross west, we have gusts up to as high as 50 miles per hour. That's going to start at 6 a.m. on Monday and then last until 1 a.m. on Tuesday. For specific details of your areas, check our website, weather.gov/Alaska, and you can get any updates to any of those forecasts, the timings and strengths of those winds. Now we also have some advisories down in southwest Alaska. We'll go to more of a map view to view this one here with these high surf advisories. These are from areas from Kipnik east until Nushagak Bay, and this is so it's specifically for the Kuskokwim Bay area and down in the Bristol Bay area from areas from Nushagak Bay west. And so these are going to be high surf advisories from 2 a.m. on Monday until 6 p.m. on Monday. Watch out for high surf and coastal erosion possible with the large low that we have moving into the area that we'll check out now. Starting off on satellite, we can see the low center south of the eastern Aleutian Islands pushing in past Unalaska into the southern portions of the Bering Sea. And you can watch, as we watch this loop again, we have the frontal system from this system pushing up through the Bering into southwest Alaska. And we have more of that cloud cover out over Kodiak Island, where we start to see a triple point there, where we can still see where the warm and cold fronts are from this system. Out over mainland Alaska, we have some lower cloud cover out over some of the areas, especially as we get further up to the north in the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline. And then down in the Panhandle area, we have some cloud cover there as well. For today's weather, we can watch our system moving up to the north. We can see some of the isobars packing tight there, resulting in some stronger winds for southwest Alaska through the Alaska Peninsula as well by Kodiak Island. But some of those strongest winds are going to push up as we get closer towards the Alaska Range as this system continues to move inland. We do have rain for today extending into the southern portions of Kenai Peninsula through Kodiak Island, all of southwest Alaska. Some areas of fog up by the Bering Strait area up towards Point Hope, and then further to the north we're seeing a mix of rain and fog, some rain over eastern portions of the Brooks Range, and some rain way down in the southern portions of the Panhandle. Still have some clear skies over some portions of the interior and some areas of south central as well, but that cloud cover continuing to extend in over the area as time passes by. We also have some northerly flow on the western side of our low pressure system, bringing some rain to the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. As we move into tonight, the main low center is going to push up towards Nunavik Island, with the front extending well into the interior portion of the state, pushing rain up through the interior into the Brooks Range all throughout the west coast and southern mainland. We can see some areas of snow on the map. However, I do want to point out that all of those areas are for areas in the mountains of the Brooks Range, Alaska Range, Talkeetna Mountains, some areas of the Chugach, Wrangell, St. Elias, All low-lying areas around the state are still expected to be rained for tonight and tomorrow. We are seeing this rain start to push in through the Gulf of Alaska with that low that formed in northern portions of the Gulf, bringing in rain closer towards the Panhandle and covering Yakutat for tonight. We also have some rain moving into areas of the central portions of the Bering Sea, down into the central and eastern Aleutian Islands as well, with some ridging out further to the west. As we move into Monday, a new system is starting to approach the western Aleutian Islands, bringing more rain to the area, with our ridging to the east of that over the central Aleutian Islands. Our main low is now pushed up towards the Norton Sound area, still bringing rain to areas of the central and eastern Bering and down into the central and eastern Aleutian Islands. We also have rain widespread through much of mainland Alaska, especially as we get further to the west, closer towards the low itself and along the North Gulf Coast. That does include Kodiak Island as well. And we still see some areas of snow in the mountains. Again, all the low-lying areas around the Alaska Range and South Central and up by the Brooks Range, low-lying areas still expected to be rain, but we might see some snow in the mountains. Up along the Arctic coastline, a mixture of rain and fog is expected that's going to extend down towards the Point Hope area. And now down in the Panhandle, rain has spread out and now extends into central areas of the Panhandle as well as northern areas and by Yakutat. As we look into Tuesday, we're going to start to see some of that rain move back a little bit to the north in the Panhandle, not as much in the central locations. We'll have rain all along the North Gulf Coast and all of South Central Alaska and Southwest. Again, we're going to see some snow in the mountains. Low-lying areas still expected to be rain. That's going to be true for the Brooks Range area as well. Rain widespread through the interior, all along the west coast of the state and along the Arctic coastline. Now, on the northern portions of the Arctic coast up by AKwx, we are going to see some chances for some of that snow to make it towards the surface with a mix of rain and snow expected up there far to the north. As we move further into the fall time, we are going to see more of this snow moving into our pattern. We have high pressure out over the eastern Aleutian Islands, and behind that we have the other system that's pushing in towards the western Aleutian Islands, extending rain closer and closer towards the central Aleutians as well. Taking a look now at our temperatures, starting with our low temperatures on Monday morning. Out for the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down into the mid-40s, lower 50s for the Bristol Bay area, and right around 50 degrees for the YK Delta. Back into the mid-40s for the Seward Peninsula, all the way through the interior and the northern locations of South Central Alaska, upper 40s for much of the rest of South Central as we get closer towards the water. From the Brooks Range further north, we're expecting temperatures to drop into the mid-30s and through the pass down to 32. In the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down into the mid-40s, with some areas closer towards the Gulf staying in the 50s. As we look at our high temps for Monday afternoon, seeing temperatures in the Panhandle jump back up into the 60s for southern locations and near 70 as we get furthest to the south, up to near 60 as we get to northern locations of the Panhandle, and lower 60s for much of South Central. Going to be a little bit colder there in Talkeetna, staying at 58. For the central and eastern portions of the interior, expecting temperatures to drop into the lower 60s, and then for the western locations, mid-50s are expected. Up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures right around 40 degrees. Kotzebue Sound area, upper 40s to right around 50. Mid-50s for the YK Delta area, and upper 50s for the Bristol Bay area. Mid-50s expected for the Alaska Peninsula, and much of the Aleutians, where we'll also see some lower 50s. Temperatures on Tuesday morning dropping down back into the mid-40s for the Aleutian Islands, upper 40s for the Bristol Bay area and YK Delta area, extending those 40s into all of the interior and out by the Seward Peninsula, and then down into the mid-30s for the Arctic coastline and for the South Central area, staying in the upper 40s to some places right around 50 degrees. And down in the Panhandle area, temperatures dropping down to the lower to mid-50s with 48 expected low for Yakutat. As we move into Tuesday afternoon, temperatures in the Panhandle once again warmest further to the south. Areas like Ketchikan and Metlakatla getting up to 70 degrees, whereas we're going to see mid-60s for areas further to the north with Yakutat at 61. Right around 60 degrees for South Central. In the 50s for the interior down into southwest Alaska. In the upper 30s to right around 40 degrees for the Arctic coastline. Mid-50s for the Alaska Peninsula, right around 50 degrees for much of the Aleutian Islands, and 54 degrees for St. Paul.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather for Monday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we have a lot of MVFR conditions, and then we can see where our low is moving through the area that we also have some IFR conditions moving from the YK Delta area down through the central portions of the Bering Sea into the eastern Aleutian Islands. You can also see where our front is pushing through mainland Alaska, where we have some areas of IFR extending into the western and central interior, down into the Alaska Range, and places of the North Gulf Coast and down into the Central Gulf as well. Further to the east, we have VFR conditions expected for southeast Alaska, and eastern portions of the interior will also see VFR conditions, and then IFR conditions up along the Arctic coastline. For Monday afternoon, continuing to see IFR conditions along the Arctic coastline in some areas of the Brooks Range as well. IFR conditions extending through the Kotzebue Sound area and down the rest of the west coast of the state through southwest Alaska into the northern portions of the Bristol Bay area. Also going to have some MVFR conditions extending into western portions of the mainland and down in south central as well. Down in the Panhandle area, MVFR conditions will be making their way into central and northern locations, and then widespread MVFR conditions out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians with some areas of IFR as well. In Tuesday morning, more IFR conditions will be moving into the Aleutian Islands area, with MVFR out for much of the Bering Sea. From the YK Delta area further to the north, we're going to see IFR conditions along the west coast of the state into some areas of mainland as well, extending up into the Brooks Range and along the Arctic coastline. For eastern portions of the interior, VFR conditions are expected with MVFR through much of south central until we get to the North Gulf Coast where IFR conditions are expected. Then IFR for central and northern locations of the Panhandle with MVFR conditions further to the south. Finally, on Tuesday afternoon, going to see the Panhandle clearing up to MVFR conditions throughout the area. IFR out over the Gulf of Alaska, but MVFR along much of the North Gulf Coast. VFR conditions for many of the other low-lying areas of south central, but into the Alaska Range, we're going to see some MVFR conditions, and MVFR conditions extending out through the central and western interior down into southwest Alaska, with some IFR conditions up through the Seward Peninsula, Brooks Range, and Arctic coastline. Down in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, primarily a mixture of MVFR and IFR conditions are expected. Looking through the passes starting up north in the Brooks Range, Anaktuvuk Pass will be MVFR dropping down to IFR conditions in the afternoon. Adigan Pass will also start off marginal and drop down to IFR. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be MVFR throughout the day on Monday. Rainy Pass also expected to be MVFR. However, Windy Pass will start off IFR and improve to MVFR conditions in the afternoon. Isabel Pass should be MVFR throughout the day on Monday, and Mentastas should remain VFR for all day on Monday. Tenedo Pass expected to be marginal all day, and Portage will start off IFR and improve to marginal conditions in the afternoon. Chilkoot and White will both start off VFR and then drop down to MVFR as the lower ceilings move into the area. For our freezing levels on Monday morning, you can see some of the warmer air coming up from the south, pushing in freezing levels of about 14,000 feet to the southern locations of the Panhandle. Some of those 12,000 foot levels moving into the southeastern portions of mainland Alaska. Colder air up further to the north, 2,000 feet right along the northwestern coastline. And then some area of colder air moving into the western portion of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands with 4,000 feet dropping down into the North Pacific just south of the central Aleutians. For our icing, with this big system with all the moisture it is bringing, we do see a fair amount of icing in the area, starting with the eastern Aleutians and Pribilof Islands between 4,000 and 7,000 feet, and becoming above 6,000 feet for southwest Alaska, extending up through much of the central and northern portions of the mainland, above 7,000 feet expected in most locations further to the north. As we look at our jet, what is driving this system in over the state, bringing some of those stronger winds, we have jet stream moving through the Cook Inlet area at as high as 145 knots, dropping down to 95 knots out of our northeastern portions of the state and around 130 by Kodiak Island. A little bit weaker by the southwestern areas. We're going to see out over the YK Delta area, 80 knots out of a southwest direction, and then 60 knots out of a northerly direction for the western Aleutians. Down to 9,000 feet. Strongest winds, once again, out of a southwesterly direction near Kodiak Island, 65 to 70 knots expected, dropping down to 50 to 55 out over the southern mainland, still out of that southwest direction, and then as low as 35 as we get up by the Brooks Range. Out over the Bering Sea, we're going to see northerly winds, 45 knots west of the Pribilof Islands, moving down into the eastern Aleutians around 40 knots, and then 35 knots just near the Panhandle area out of a westerly direction. Down to 3,000 feet, strongest winds still around our low pressure system by the Bristol Bay area, 50 to 55 knots out of a southwest direction. Barrier jet, 55 knots out of an easterly direction, moving into Prince William Sound, and 50 knots out of a northerly direction west of the low pressure system. Widespread turbulence out over the area with some severe out by the Bethel area through much of the Alaska Range below 6,000 feet and below 4,000 feet by the eastern Aleutians.
So that Galena flood back in 2013 was at the intersection of weather and climate. Rick, I often get questions about the difference between weather and climate. How do you distinguish between the two?
Well, that's a really good question, John. One of the analogies that I like to use, the wardrobe analogy. So in my closet, in my dresser, I've got clothes appropriate for 90-degree weather and 50 below weather. That's the climate part of my wardrobe. Well, what I'm going to put on today, am I going to wear my Hawaiian shirt because it's going to be a hot July day, or am I going to wear my bunny boots because it's going to be 50 below? That's the weather part of my wardrobe.
You know, there's another interesting analogy. I've heard it said that climate is like your personality, whereas weather is like the mood you're in today. It's like that old John Denver song. Some days are diamonds and some days are stones. That's how weather works.
Of course, it's really a continuous range. Just as the Galena ice jam flooding was the result of a weather event, that ice jam, up against that cold spring, a climate event. So too with less impactful events. For instance, a daily record high temperature is a weather event, one day's high. But we put that in a climate context, say comparing to a century or more of individual temperatures on a given date.
So these extreme events like record high temperatures also happen on the seasonal time scale. Just in the last few years, we've had what was called a marine heat wave in the waters south of Alaska, the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea. But the water temperatures in that area set new records in 2015 and 2016.
And most Alaskans are acutely aware that big wildfire seasons are becoming more and more common, most recently in 2015. And the frequency of million-acre seasons has doubled since the early 1990s.
Just this past winter, we had another event in the Bering Sea. The ice extent in the Bering was lower than it had ever been in the last 150 years. That's about as far back as the good records go. There'd never been another year like this one in the Bering with so little sea ice. That had major impacts on the communities along the west coast and the northwest coast.
So, John, what have you been hearing from folks around town about these kind of climate extremes?
I've heard from a number of people who've been here a long time that winters just aren't what they used to be. The average temperatures are higher than they were back in the 1960s and 1970s, and we just don't get the extreme cold days, the days down in the minus 50s or even the minus 60s that we used to experience in Fairbanks back in the 1960s, 1970s, and even into the 1980s.
Well, and it's not just winter either. 2016 and 2017, the summers brought unusually muggy, humid weather to Fairbanks. We're not used to thinking of that in interior Alaska, but record high humidities during the summer months. As in the winter, we've had a significant increase in freezing rain events, since about 2000. So much so that DOT has changed their road treatment strategy, and now we have the school district building in winter rain days into the calendar. And of course, we all need good weather forecasts for these high impact weather events.
We know, though, that weather forecasts are sometimes wrong just 3 or 4 days in advance. So if these weather forecasts and the models they're based on can't pick up events like freezing rain 3 or 4 days ahead, how can we believe what they say about climate for the future?
Well, that's a really good question, John. And I think the important thing to remember is that parts of the system are predictable.
So climate models can't give you weather for particular days or even for particular months or years. They actually predict averages. These are averages over periods of a decade or two, or even averages over periods of several years. So they don't give us the month-to-month information that we might want. What are they telling us about the future, though?
Well, these climate models are telling us on the decades-long time frames that warmer winters are going to become more common. We're going to have more frequent, very low sea ice years with late freeze up and early meltout. And the same will be true on Alaskan rivers. We'll have more frequent seasons when freeze up is late and break up is early.
One of the other common threads in these climate model predictions is that heavy rain events and heavy snow events will become more common in the future. That's actually a prediction that the models make for mid-latitudes as well as for high latitudes in areas like Alaska. So we can expect the heavy downpours to become heavier and the heavy winter snows to become heavier than we've been used to. They're also predicting more frequent freezing rain events, getting back to what you talked about earlier. These events that might have happened just once every year or two in the past could actually end up happening several times in a winter in the future, according to the climate models.
And it is important to remember that even in a warming world, there are still going to be seasons and years that are colder than the average, but these cold seasons will become less and less common. So, John, maybe I don't need to have those bunny boots in my closet anymore?
Well, at least you won't need to wear them as often as you did in the past.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section. We'll start off with a look at our ices. As you can notice, we have a lot of the navigational waters are ice-free, but we do want to point out some of the ice in the Beaufort Sea. There's a fetch of multi-year ice coming in from the Canadian archipelago that's allowing for slower ice melt for the Beaufort Sea, which is why we see some of that ice there, which is slower of a melt than what we saw last year at this time. However, out over the Chukchi Sea, we have open water in some areas up to as far north as 80 north. Now, that doesn't mean all of the Chukchi Sea is open water, but there are some areas reaching up there to 80 north, which is a faster melt than what we saw last year this time. On Monday, for the southeastern portions of the state in the inside water, southeasterly winds 10 to 15 knots are expected, seas up to as high as 3 feet. And in the southern locations, northerly winds 10 knots. Out over the Gulf, eastern portions of the Gulf, westerly winds 10 to 15 knots, becoming southerly 25 knots as we get closer towards Yakutat, and then southeasterly winds 35 knots along the North Gulf Coast, seas up to as high as 11 feet in the northern Gulf. On Tuesday, in the inside waters, southerly winds 20 knots for Lynn Canal area, becoming more northerly as we move to the central and southern locations of the inside waters, 15 to 20 knots expected there. Out over eastern portions of the Gulf, we have northwesterly winds 20 knots, seas 8 feet, and becoming more westerly and eventually southwesterly as we get closer towards Yakutat, around 15 knots, and then southerly winds 15 knots in the northern Gulf. For south central area on Monday, southerly winds through the western Gulf 20 to 25 knots, strongest by the Barren Islands, and then we have our barrier jet southeasterly winds 35 knots along the North Gulf Coast, pushing into Prince William Sound where we have easterly winds 30 knots also associated with that barrier jet. In the Cook Inlet area, south to southeast winds 30 to 35 knots, getting stronger as we get further to the south. And then west of the Barren Islands, southeast winds 35 knots there as well. Seas as high as 12 feet for the Cook Inlet area and down by the western Barrens. And then highest seas in the area, 14 feet by the North Gulf coastline. On Tuesday, things lightening up quite a bit. Southerly winds throughout the area, 10 to 15 knots out over the Gulf and in the Prince William Sound area, 15 to 20 knots from the Kamishak Bay area up through Cook Inlet. On Monday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, southwest to southerly winds for all areas, 30 to 35 knots for the most part, 25 knots east of Kodiak Island. Seas up to as high as 17 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Then on Tuesday, winds calming down quite a bit, southwesterly winds 10 knots on the Pacific side, 15 to 20 knots on the Bering side, and 15 knots through Shelikof Strait. Seas up to as high as 8 feet, highest on the Pacific side. On Monday for the Aleutian Islands, westerly flow for the central and eastern Aleutians. up to as high as 30 knots by the eastern Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians. As we move closer towards the western Aleutian Islands, winds will become southerly around 25 knots with seas at 8 feet. Highest seas, however, are going to be 15 feet south of the eastern Aleutians. Then on Tuesday, for the central and eastern Aleutians, winds calming down a bit, southerly to southwesterly flow 10 knots, becoming southerly 15 to 20 knots for the central Aleutians. However, by the western Aleutian Islands, southerly winds up to as high as 35 knots with seas as high as 13 feet. Along the west coast of the state, we can see circulation around our low pressure system out by the YK Delta area. We are going to see winds south of Nunavik Island, southwesterly 40 knots, seas up to 16 feet. By the Pribilof Islands, westerly winds 25 knots. St. Matthew Island, northerly winds 30 knots. It's also going to be true by St. Lawrence Island. North of Nunavik Island, northwesterly winds 15 knots. And then southeasterly winds 25 knots in the Norton Sound area. On Tuesday, winds calming down as that low pushes further to the north and weakens. And then we'll have winds out of a west to northwesterly direction, 15 to 20 knots for much of the southern locations. Northerly winds 25 knots by St. Lawrence Island. And then in the Norton Sound area, southwesterly winds 20 knots are expected. Along the Arctic coastline on Monday, northeasterly winds 20 knots. Down the west coast, 25 to 30 knots, also out of that northeasterly direction. And then northerly winds 30 knots to the Bering Strait. On Tuesday, easterly winds 15 to 20 knots for the Arctic coastline, and then along the west coast, northerly winds at 25 knots are expected, seas as high as 9 feet. For a recap for tonight's weather, we have our low pushing in towards the Nunavik Island area with its front extending into mainland Alaska, and another low off the old triple point forming in the northern part of the Gulf of Alaska, bringing more rain to all of mainland Alaska with the exception of the Arctic coastline where we'll see some fog. We do have high wind warnings out for areas all around the Alaska range and eastern portions of the interior. Those are primarily through the passes with winds gusting up to as high as 80 miles per hour in the eastern part of the Alaska range.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.